This course is about free will and how it might operate at a neural level in the brain. In later segments, we'll carefully define terms like free will, causation, indeterminism, and so on. But before we get into philosophical and scientific details about how mental events might be causal in a top-down manner in the brain, let's reflect a bit on the meanings of the word freedom. Why would we want to have a free will anyway? Presumably to maximize our freedom. But freedom from what? External control? And freedom to do what? Just to do whatever we want? If so, what do we really want to do in this life? Many people, especially many of us in the West, have a default notion of freedom as freedom from constraints. Many of us don't want people telling us what to do or violating our liberty in other ways. An example of this would be freedom from people stealing our things, and freedom from them harming our bodies, or even freedom from violations of our privacy. No doubt it was a big surprise to many people that they were being surveilled online. I think it's pretty obvious why we would want freedom from any of those violations of our personal liberty. But let's say we live in a perfect world where there are no violations of our personal liberty, a world without theft or war, and one without mass government and corporate surveillance. Would that be enough to feel free or to be free? If one thought that freedom from constraint was the sole and ultimate form of freedom, a conquistador or a cowboy living far away from society and any government or police who is beholden to no one is maximally free, surviving and perhaps even thriving by virtue of individual guts, wits, perseverance, and strength. In other societies, however, this rugged individualism might be regarded as selfish, unwise, and perhaps even pathological. Such societies might regard real freedom as possible only under the constraints afforded by a society in which what you can do is defined by shared agreements concerning what is allowed and good. Just as you can only speak and be understood given the constraints imposed upon you by your mother language and a community of speakers who follow set grammatical rules, and just as a bird can fly only by virtue of the constraints imposed upon it by the air, to use Immanuel Kant's example, we can only be free inside of a system that constrains our actions, simultaneously defining what is possible by making certain actions impossible, wrong, or impermissible. Even in the West, there's an understanding that binding contracts and the rule of law, which constrain human action, afford the trust and security required to attain the freedom to start a business or to take financial risks. Even in the West, there's another current of understanding human freedom as freedom within constraints. Consider a great pianist, say Vladimir Horowitz. He came to this world knowing nothing about the piano. Perhaps his parents constrained his freedom by forcing him to practice against his will. Over time, his nervous system chunked and automatized the recognition of notes from isolated black dots to chord patterns, recognizing a C chord at a glance, say, rather than having to work it out, followed by meta-chunks of chord sequences and probably meta-chunks of these meta-chunks. The same happened in his motoric system. At first, the C chord was potentially exhausting to execute. In time, this became automatized. Then whole sequences of such chunks became automatized into longer and longer motor sequences. And the mapping between perceptual and motor chunks also became automatized. His own volitional attentional circuitry functioned as a good teacher should, making itself no longer necessary. Volitional attention played a role in gluing together simpler representations in his working memory, which, metaphorically speaking, hardened, allowing previously disjoint units to be stored, recalled, recognized, and executed subsequently as units and meta-units. In a word, Vladimir Horowitz began mastering the piano. The years-long process of transforming his nervous system required constraints. He had to practice and was not playing the violin or video games, but this in the end afforded him a deeper freedom of action within the severe constraints of the piano. This might be thought of as the freedom to play directly from his chest, as opposed to being constrained by the cumbersome inefficiencies that plague most dilettantes and beginners. Different cultures seem to me to have different attitudes toward freedom. My father's from China and my mother's from Germany. They met in England and then moved to New York City where I was born and grew up. They had very different attitudes about freedom, raising children, and the cultivation of mastery. Let me give a sort of comedic or tragic but telling example. When I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, my father came home and said something like, "My son must learn the violin." And my mother, being German, saw little point in imposing this on me. She asked me, "So, Peterlein, would you like to learn the violin?" I knew how to play my parents' differences against each other for maximal gain to myself. I said, "What? No way. I hate the violin, and you can't make me." Then my father turned to my mother and asked, "Why did you ask him? Do you ask him if he wants to brush his teeth?" My mother said, "Well, isn't it his choice? Doesn't he have free will?" This story is kind of tragic because I won, and I never learned the violin. I wish now that my father had won that battle, because now I might be able to play the violin. But we can see from this example how different their two cultures were regarding freedom. My mother emphasized self-determination and freedom from constraint, whereas my father emphasized the imposition of his will for my own good in order to foster eventual freedom within constraint, namely mastery of the violin. The role played by Vladimir Horowitz's parents was the role of scaffolding. Scaffolding is not part of a building, but is necessary for its construction. Once the building is built, you can take away the scaffolding, and it is as if it was never there. Similarly, parents and our social structures were essential to the building of our minds and the cultivation of the freedoms that we have cultivated in ourselves. We did not, for example, create our mother language. Rather, it was there as scaffolding, being spoken all around us as children. And now that we have incorporated our mother language into the very workings of our nervous system and thought processes, we have gained tremendous freedom to think in abstract sorts of ways afforded by language. If you look at children raised with very little scaffolding, such as those feral children raised by wolves, it's obvious just how much we owe to those who provided the scaffolding of love, guidance, language, and society to us. It's truly because of the scaffolding afforded to us by our parents, peers, and mentors that we have the minds and volitional capacities that we now have. It seems to me that the role of a parent has changed from being a purveyor of culture and values to one now of functioning in part as a shield to keep out the bad sides of a mass culture that's quite simply undermining the cultivation of mastery and therefore of deeper human freedoms. Mass culture so often undermines cultivating the kind of deeper freedom earned by paying attention for long stretches of time in the pursuit of mastering some domain through practice. It seems, in the phases of life, that it makes sense to have a period of exploration as freedom from constraint before one commits to a path, for example, to a career or a spouse or a location, and willingly submits to the constraints required to attain a deeper freedom within those constraints. A young person might try this instrument or that for some years before committing to the piano. But if we met them at the age of 50, still trying out this and that, having mastered none of them, we might feel sorry for them. On the other hand, if a child is forced to commit too early without having ever explored, we might again feel sorry for them. So really, there seems to be a sweet spot in life where we explore in order to find out that which best suits us, and then we go for depth. Of course, this does not only apply to instruments, but is really a metaphor to the commitments we make in life in search of deeper freedoms, whether this is a commitment to a life partner, or to a cause, or to a career, or to something else. Let me also point out that most of our volitional decisions probably don't matter to our life outcomes in the long run. For example, if I choose to eat pizza for dinner tonight or a piece of salmon, that probably won't make much difference in the long run. Next month, I probably won't even be able to remember what I ate at all. But some of our volitional decisions are consequential for our lives. These are decisions that affect every other decision that will follow in our lives. In this category, I would put decisions such as whether to marry, and if so, whom to marry, whether to have kids, and if so, how many, what country to live in, and what career to pursue. These decisions are not ones we take lightly, as we might in deciding arbitrarily whether to point at something with our left hand or with our right hand. Since it doesn't really matter which finger we move, we simply pick one, seemingly randomly. Consequential decisions, however, are not ones where we pick arbitrarily between left and right. Typically, we deliberate. We go over the pluses and minuses of, for example, choosing a life partner. If we are posed with 2 or more options, we might deliberate for weeks, months, or even years. We might play things out in our imaginations. We might say, well, Bob is kinder, more intelligent, and better looking, but Tom is richer, comes from a better family, and speaks my mother language. I believe that free will lies in the domain of such deliberations. That is, I think the human imagination is where the action is in volitionally choosing among deliberated options. Free will has little, if anything, to do with meaningless and arbitrary hand movements that we might pick randomly for no particular reason at all. If the deeper freedom that we humans strive and long for is the ability to act as we want within a domain that we have freedom to act within, because we have mastered that domain, then freedom from constraint and rugged individualism are not enough. Freedom from constraint is only useful to give us the freedom to explore and then choose the domains of mastery where we can become free within constraints. One of the most important domains of mastery is, of course, mastery within and over the events in our own minds. Different cultures again seem to take radically different attitudes toward the notion of self-mastery or self-cultivation. But interestingly, there's a metaphor of the self that pops up again and again in world literature, probably because it captures some essence of the disunity of the human mind and the internal struggles that we all deal with. The metaphor describes a rider and his horse or horses. It can be found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Plato's Republic, and even in the writings of Sigmund Freud. In one version of this metaphor, a charioteer who represents reason or executive control is in a chariot being pulled by several horses that can be taken to represent the desires and the emotions. Perhaps one horse represents greed, another lust, another fear, and so on. The ancient Greeks took the view that a good life is one where the charioteer governs his horses well and harnesses their inherent power toward the attainment of glory. In contrast, medieval Christians probably regarded the horses as evil and in need of constant whipping to keep them from leading the charioteer astray. In Buddhism, in contrast, the horses might not be regarded as evil, but they are also not to be followed or allowed to be in charge of where one goes with one's mind or actions. Rather, the horses should be watched and gradually reined in over and over, a practice where eventually they will no longer wander off but will stay put in the here and now. If deeper freedom is attained through mastery of some domain of thought or action, and if the most central freedom is the freedom we attain through mastery over our own minds, then free will is most centrally about what we choose to master and what kind of person we intend to and then strive through practice to become. Later in this course, we'll return to this notion of free will as not only the having of the capacities affording freedom to act, but also, more importantly, the deeper free will expressed in our capacity to choose to become a new kind of chooser in the future.